The Traveller's League Book 1 The Timepiece, written by Nick Goss. Soaking wet and exhausted, Hoops lay curled up in a ball, shivering violently. The cool, fresh air around him smelled like dirt and pine. He lay on the ground, with rich green ferns all around him. He certainly wasn't in his bedroom. He checked the pocket watch and saw that it was set for 5 o'clock. He tried to make sense of what was happening. I must have set it to 5 o'clock by mistake. Or maybe it reset itself again. It did that a few times on the very first day. Looking at the forest all around him, his eyes fell on delicate flowers and tall, thick red-wooded trees. The little sunshine that made it through the canopy of leaves above was quite warm, but the air was devilishly cool. He knew that if he kept this wetsuit on for too long, he would catch a cold, or worse, get hypothermia. He walked over to one of these huge trees that had fallen long ago, broke some limbs off, gathered up some ferns and fallen branches, and made a little lean-to for shelter. Crawling inside, he took off the wetsuit and tried to dry himself off. As midday slid into the afternoon, he found he wasn't getting much warmer. His shaking was getting worse. Desperate for warmth, he found 2 dry sticks and tried to start a fire by rubbing them together. But his hands were so cold and stiff, and his body was so chilly and shaky, he gave up in discouragement. He threw the sticks away from him and started to cry. He was afraid, alone and cold. He was done with exploration and only wanted to go home. As he sobbed with his head between his knees, he heard a squatty little voice in the ferns in front of him. "Hush, hush, not too loud now." Hoops looked up to see a small, round man-like form waddling towards him from behind the fern. The little man couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall. Wiping the tears from his eyes, Hoops jumped up so quickly he banged his head on the fallen tree trunk. "Ouch! Easy, young traveller. I bear you no ill at all." He was a small dwarf wearing an animal skin tunic and pants. He had a broad belt and a hat made of fern leaves. His nose was large and round, and his mouth and chin were buried deep within a brown, scraggly beard with bits of leaves and grass throughout. "There, there," the dwarf whispered as he slipped a pack off his fat, roundish back. "Let me help you. On my word as a wallipog, I am vowed to assist you. Yes, assist you." He pulled an animal skin blanket out of the pack and tossed it over Hoops' shoulders. Immediately, Hoops felt soft warmth seeping back into his body. "Thank you," he shivered. "How do you know I'm a traveller?" "Hush, hush, all your questions will be answered in time." The dwarf was nervous and looked around as he whispered. "Not now, though. Not now. Now is the time for being quiet and following old Wally Tom." Hoops decided to trust the kind dwarf and gathered his scuba gear and wetsuit laying on the ground. "Leave that stinky mess, boyo," the little man insisted. "It stinks of fish and pea. They'll be able to track us down with no magic but their noses." The dwarf looked at the timepiece on the ground. "You'd best hold on to that pretty thing, though. You don't want him getting hold of it, or knowing it's here again." "Who are you talking about? Who's him?" Hoops asked, but Wally Tom didn't answer. He was already scampering away, nervously checking the noises in the air and scanning the forest all around. He led the way through thick brush and around earthen mounds. He looked this way and that, always stopping suddenly when a bird would sing or when the wind would blow. His fat little feet were bare but left no footprints. He moved in complete silence. Hoops, on the other hand, felt like a clumsy, loud goofball as he stomped behind the dwarf. "Where are we going, Wally Tom?" "Green Doin's place," the dwarf whispered. "He can help. He always helps travellers." They kept stalking through the forest until they came to an open field. On the other side was the tiny village of Wallipogs. The roofs of their tiny homes were no more than 6 feet tall, and each one had a smoking little chimney and little fences containing small gardens of flowers and vegetables. As they passed through the village, bearded, fat faces smiled and waved. On the far side of the village, they came to a large red-wooded tree, just like all the others in the forest. Wally Tom knocked on the trunk 3 times with his chubby little fist. A hidden door popped open right out of the wood, and a happy old voice inside said, "Come in! Wally Tom, did you bring him? Is he with you?" "Yes, Doin, yes, he's here now." The dwarf led Hoops through the tree trunk and into a human-sized cabin. There was a great big fireplace with logs blazing and comfy animal skin couches in front of it. Standing next to the hearth was a tall, grey-bearded man in a forest green cloak. He held a pot of freshly brewed tea. "Pleased to meet you, young traveller. I'm Green Doin. I'm the protector of the Wallypogs, keeper of the forest and allied to all travellers. You would probably call me a wizard, but I don't like to brag about my magic." When he said magic, the smoke from the fireplace shot out into the room and formed the image of the timepiece. Hoops almost forgot his manners. He had never seen real magic before. "I'm Worthington D. Hooper, but my friends call me Hoops," the happy wizard interrupted. "Come and sit by my fire and get warm, boy. Wally Tom, please fetch some new clothes for our guest." The dwarf smiled and went his way back into the village to carry out Doin's errand. "Now tell me about your journey through the 4 gates, the wizard said as he pulled out a writing quill and an old book. "The 4 whats?" Hoops didn't have a clue what he meant. "The first 4 worlds of the timepiece," the wizard explained. "There are 4 trial worlds a traveller must pass through before they can explore the remaining 5 worlds. They are known as the 4 gates. Let's start with what you'd call 1 o'clock. Hoops warmed himself and drank tea while giving Doin every detail of his adventures on the island, in the mirror, the shadow world and the underwater realm. He talked for hours while the wizard made notes in his book. "You're a brave boy and a true hero. It is a pleasure to meet you and have you in my humble home. I'm sure you have some questions about some of the stranger things you've experienced, yes?" Hoops nodded his head and said, 2 different times I heard a voice. It whispered to me, it knew my name and it came from a pair of black eyes. They looked like orbs made of ink. What was that?" "That," Doin explained, "was the voice of Braxo. He is the black wizard who terrorizes Sirihbaz." "Sirihbaz?" Hoops had never thought that these worlds might have names. This was the first world where he met intelligent people who knew he was a traveller. "You are in Sirihbaz now, Hoops. This is the world of wizards and enchantments. This is the world where magic lives. There is great beauty here, and wonders beyond that one can even begin to explain. But those who misuse the magic of this world, like Braxo, create misery, slavery, and darkness. Braxo seeks power above all, and he knows that the timepiece exists, and that it is the only magic that will allow him to escape this world. If he ever gets the timepiece, he will take his dark magic to the other worlds to conquer them and enslave their peoples." "But what about the eyes?" Hoops reminded the Green Wizard. "Ah, yes. Braxo cannot enter the other worlds yet, but he can look into them through the eyes of other creatures. When he casts his dark spells, the creatures' eyes will turn black, and they won't know they are being used or controlled. He can speak to their minds and manipulate their thoughts and feelings, and sometimes even control their bodies. It amazes me that he is now powerful enough to use even dead creatures, like that poor mermaid skeleton." Hoop shivered just thinking about that skull with the glowing black eyes. "How did he know my name?" I don't know. Braxo grows more powerful year by year. He knows that the travelers often make it through the 4 gates and into Sirihbaz. He's constantly seeking to trap any boy that arrives in Sirihbaz and steal the timepiece from him. You're in great danger, Hoops. In all the other worlds he can see you, but here in Sirihbaz he can capture you and hurt you. His magic is most powerful here. But I feel safe with you here in your home. Hoops felt a real friendship between him and Duin. Things began to make sense and he didn't want to leave, even though he knew he endangered himself and the Wollipog village. My forest magic is hopefully strong enough to hide you from his eyes, but once you leave my home, his eyes and ears will be everywhere. He probably knows you're here in Sirihbaz. He's already hunting for you, most likely. Can you defeat him with your magic? No. I can only protect the Wollipogs and keep the forest. I cannot do anything to strip Braxo of his power. I can only bring a bit of balance to the world. And if he were to travel to the other worlds, I'd have no way of stopping or slowing his destructive plans. Hoops loved this beautiful world and its good creatures. The thought of leaving it behind with a black wizard growing more powerful made him feel awful. There has to be someone powerful enough to defeat him. Only the Oracle would know if that's true, Duin smiled. That is where you'll go next. The timepiece has already been set to 7 o'clock and is ready for you to travel. Hoops pulled out the pocket watch and saw that wise old Duin was right. What about the 2 moons I saw on the island? When you were on the island of Insango and floating in its sea later, you saw the 2 worlds of Sirihbaz and Torpil. You're in one of those worlds now. The Oracle is on the other, and you will pass through more before. Thud, thud, thud. Wally Tom banged on the door from outside. His knocking sounded frantic and panicked. As Duin opened the door, the dwarf tossed a set of animal skin clothes to him, then fell to the floor exhausted and bloodied. Through the door, Hoops saw the entire village was on fire. Wollipogs ran everywhere crying and screaming. Some of them lay on the ground, not moving at all. He's here! The wizard shouted at Hoops. He's come for you! Quickly, Hoops, you must leave now! Just then, a slender, black-cloaked wizard emerged from the village flames and walked towards Duin's tree. Worthington, the familiar voice hissed. I found you! Give it to me, now! On the last word, he stretched out his long, skinny fingers and used his magic to throw Duin against the wall and hold him there. Hoops grabbed the bundle of clothing from the floor and rubbed the watch. The timepiece must not fall into Braxo's hands, but he felt like a coward for leaving his friends behind. Looking at Duin as the electric particles swirled around him, he shouted, I will come back! I will save Sirihbaz! Braxo was furious. He pulled out a wicked knife with a blood-red wavy blade and thrust it into Duin's chest, then turned to face Hoops. Whoosh!